I'm Bruce Gordon, author of the book, The Spirit of Attack. It's the year 2020, and I'm 85 years old. But at one time, I was a young pilot. Here I am checking out in the T-34 trainer. From the T-34, I went on to the T-28, which is a bigger propeller fighter, and I learned an awful lot about pitch controls and things like that. And then I went on to the T-33 jet trainer, my first jet. But what I want to talk to you about today is the tactics that we used in fighters in the 1950s and 1960s to attack Russian bombers, and how those attacks evolved over the years. I moved on to the F-86D. The F-86D and L were about the same fighters, so I'll talk about the D. And it had a tray underneath it for 24 FFARs, folded fin aircraft rockets, that were 2.5 inches in diameter, and that whole tray of rockets would fire at the same time in kind of a shotgun pattern. But because they were unguided, they needed a good broad target. So the plan was to fire at the broad side of the bomber. And to do that, we set up what we called an offset attack. This is an offset for the beam, where you came down to an offset point and then came down, were turned on a 90-degree beam to the target, and you would have it, 40 degrees or so on your starboard or port, either side, but you would be on your scope as you came into it. We couldn't expect to have a radar contact until we were about 10 miles away. Nowadays, they talk about contacts of over 100 miles, which was unheard of in our day. I'd sometimes get a contact at 6 miles out. And then a steering dot would appear on the scope. We'd come in right on the beam of this plane, and we would get fairly close to it before the automatic firing system would occur. The tray would drop down, and all 24 rockets would go out in one bang looking for that bomber, and we would come so close that we would pass, they said we would pass about 40 feet above the tail of the bomber. That was fairly good until we got more advanced things and missiles. And with the F-102 on that, even though the F-102 had 24 rockets also in the doors that came down that opened, the F-102 also had missiles, both radar and infrared missiles. The radar missiles now on a beam would not be in a very good position, because chaff, which was the most common ECM at that time, works fairly effectively if you don't have a difference in overtake between the overtake on the real bomber and the overtake on the chaff that's right behind the bomber. So a beam attack against chaff was not good. So we went to a stern attack. Now, the stern attack, which would be useless in a F-86D because those rockets would have a very small target shooting from the stern, and also there's a tail gunner in that thing, and the F-86D would get so close that probably that tail gunner would shoot you down before you got a chance to fire. But the F-102 now had guided missiles, so it could come in behind And this stern attack would come in and bring you in so that the target was also on your scope and you could see it coming in. And you could select radar missiles or infrared missiles, depending, or fire them all at once if you really wanted to get the guy and there was only one target out there. And the F-102 could do that. Along came the Cuban crisis, and we found that the attacks against, we thought as we flew off of down at Cuba, all our strategies were based on attacking bombers. And suddenly now, we could be running into MiGs. Good heavens, what a thing could happen. How would our tactics work against fighters that might be turning into us? This offset point that they talk about would jump up and down depending on when the fighter turned. And he wouldn't just turn once, he could turn several times. He could completely foul up this radar attack. So we went to the front attack. Now, the front attack was really quite good, except that you had to come in at a fairly fast closing rate. The closing rate was very good against chaff, for instance, but it gave the pilot very little time to get the target on your scope and lock in, because your closing rate is now twice what it would be on a side attack, and maybe 3 or 4 times what it would be on a stern attack. A stern attack requires a 1.2 to 1 speed advantage, so you can catch up on him from behind. If you don't have a 1.2 to 1 speed advantage, don't use a stern attack. You have to go to a front attack. And a front attack, he can be coming really fast. As a matter of fact, my best front attack was against a Bomark missile that was a target for me. It was coming fired in Florida over the Gulf of Mexico, and I was over the Gulf of Mexico, and it was coming at me at about 64,000 feet, and I was down at about 45,000 feet using a snap-up attack. The snap-up attack was really good against a high-altitude target, or even one that wasn't quite so high up. As being down below, you had a better radar reflection, a better radar return than you did with a straight front-on, where you had just the front of the airplane and not so much radar. So if you came in from below, you had a better radar reflection. Also, it made sure you didn't run into him, and I could come in at high speed. As a matter of fact, the test in Florida against the Bomark missile was a test of the entire F-106 system to see that it could handle a target closing at me at about 2,000 miles an hour. That was a test point to qualify the F-106. I was the first person to be committed against it, and I made an attack and snapped up and shot down the Bomark missile with one infrared missile that I fired on the front. It hit the Bomark and blew off its left wing. Now, it was coming at me, by the way, at 2,000 miles an hour. So you can believe this thing was coming down the scope. I was really pressed in time to lock onto that thing with my missiles selected and armed them and fired, and that missile hit there and blew off the wing. Now, I had been coming up during this time, so I wasn't that far below him. And when it blew off his left wing, he rolled over and dove down on me. He was a ball of fire coming down and came right over my cockpit, very close to me. I can remember seeing a ball of fire, and suddenly I was gone on the other side, and everything was okay. come on in and do a victory roll or two and come back in and have a drink at the club. That was great. So the snap-up attack is very good against high-altitude targets such as the U-2, the SR-71. We actually never did get a good successful attack against an SR-71 because that darn thing was so fast you couldn't believe it. But the Russian Tu-64, the blinder, and the blinder would be very good for a snap-up or a frontal attack where it could be coming in supersonic. Well, the Beaumark was sure supersonic. It was about 2.5 times the speed of sound, which is faster than those would be going. So the front attack, snap-up attack were great attacks. Now, what would happen if these were actually done in a combat situation against MiGs? Now, all this controlling is being done from the ground until you pick it up on your radar. Now, one day in 1969, I was one of 4 F-106s that got committed. We were doing a BARCAP, Barrier Air Combat Patrol, against North Korean MiGs that were in North Korea. We were flying here's the map of Korea. We were flying off the east coast of Korea. There was an American reconnaissance plane, an RC-121, that was to the east of Korea. And we didn't see him. He was down low. He's a propeller plane. He goes along slow. He can stay out there forever. He's got plenty of fuel. But we were in a patrol just to make sure that he wouldn't be attacked. One of them had been attacked and shot down by MiGs only a few months before in early 1969. So we were out there just patrolling with our 4 F-106s, and out came 20 MiGs. 20. They were probably a combination. They were probably everything that they could get off that field at Wonsan. Every darn fighter they could get. There were probably every MiG 15s, 17s, 21s, anything they had at that time. But all their fighters were day fighters. They didn't have radar to speak of, and they didn't have forward-firing missiles. If anything, they had the ATOL infrared missile. So we were turned in against them, and we were turned in on a front attack. They were coming out, and we were in the barrier patrol area, so we came at them. Now, here I have my hands together. The fact is that the F-106 was such a high-altitude fighter that the MiGs and all that were probably down low. And I hadn't thought of it until we got into the situation, but they were low, below us. I would be using a snap-down attack. But I'll tell you one thing, we had good radar missiles. The Falcon F was a very good radar missile. We carried Falcon F radar missiles and Falcon G, which was an infrared missile. So I was going to select my radar missiles and come in and snap down on these guys. Now there's 20 of them. You know, I think this is going to be sort of like Custer's Last Stand, where he says it's a target-rich environment. You're right, that's going to be a target-rich. There's going to be MiGs all over the place. I just pick one that looks like a good target to me. And the 4 of us were spread out. We went into what we call our 6-pack position, where we spread out in altitude and distance so that any airplane that saw us would only see one of them and wouldn't know where the others were. So we were coming in on them, and we would each take one of the MiGs. We select radar and come in. We'll be snapping down. That'll be a bit of a strange attack going down on those guys. But firing our radar missiles. They only had guns, basically. They really couldn't do a thing. We'd be coming down supersonic from above. They didn't have a chance if they saw us at first, because they'd see only a single plane coming in, and they might not even see us because we're coming in supersonic at them. But if they did, what can they do? They can't do anything. We're going to come down, and I'm going to get my first MiG on the dive down toward them. And then everyone talks in the shows about, you know, the merge where everyone's supposed, and nah, don't turn in merge. Keep going. Darn it. Go on out a long ways away. Then when they can't see you anymore, then you turn around and come back, and we use our radar. They haven't got any radar. We're squat. So we come in, and I'm going to come in. I expect there's going to be a lot of MiGs out there. They will have turned around trying to chase us, and they won't be able to see us because we've been gone. We've been supersonic. I'll come back, and I'll go supersonic again. I had more speed than they had, and I would pick some MiG that was just looked like a juicy target to me, where I could probably get a stern shot, because this time all I have left are my infrared missiles. So I select the infrared missiles, come in there, lock on this guy, and hopefully he's going away from me a little bit, and I'll come in. I can go right through that whole bunch of MiGs. I'll be going at Mach 1.5. These guys can't even go that fast. So I'm going to come in, and they won't even know I'm coming. I'm just going to go whistling right through them, and I'm going to try to pick one MiG that's going away from me, and I'm going to nail him with our AIM-4G infrared missiles, which had a very high probability of kill. I'll get my second MiG. Now I'm out of missiles, and I'm going to keep going for a while so they can't catch me, and then I'm going to climb up to an altitude that they can't handle, and I'm going to go home, and I'm going to have a drink at the club. So that were our tactics of the 1950s, evolving into the 1960s, going from the F-86D all the way to the F-106, which was my favorite airplane. Oh, what happened to the MiGs? They turned around and went home. They chickened out, and I never got another chance to get two MiGs in one day.